was a dry, cold, and moonlit night. Perhaps it was the result of my empty-headed negligence, or perhaps it was some cursed fate, but I had found myself alone on an empty desert highway. As I desperately looked around the dreary hellscape, I could not find a single piece of evidence that gave way to some sign of civilization, save for the seemingly endless stretch of road, and the ruins in the distance, glowing hideously in the desert moonlight. I had become quite bored of waiting for the small possibility of a trucker to come along, despite only waiting a measly 2 hours, and decided to inspect the ruins, as a way to pass the time. It was just close enough that, if I saw the headlights of my savior, I would be able to run back in time to alert them, but still far enough that only those who were curious would walk the entire way there. Through thickets of parched brush and holes that I had assumed were filled with the native creatures that called this desolate land home, I stumbled my way into its vicinity. Under the illuminance of the moon I could clearly make out the details of the ruins. The walls and the entrance were wider than they were tall, and the smooth but granular texture that I felt as I glided my hand upon its desert-kissed walls had reminded me very much of limestone, although I knew it to not be the same. After I had crouched down to about half my size, I was able to squeeze through the wide opening and make my way inside. The sudden sounds of numerous animal-like noises could be heard behind me, and I hit my head against the ceiling in surprise. Just some local nocturnal wildlife, I had thought. I longed for the naivete that I had initially carried into those ruins. An eroded gap in one of the ceiling corners allowed moonlight to flutter in, which had provided me with a peculiar sight. The room was lined with small jars, there were strange markings on the walls, and multiple quarters surrounded my vision. I had to crouch down even further than I already had just to inspect the jars, which were no larger than the size of a plump rabbit, and found a tiny fingerprint painted on the body of each one. Curiosity had gotten the better of me and I attempted to open one of the jars up for an inspection of its contents, but found it rather tightly sealed. I had tried numerous grips and postures, but the lid of the jar would not budge. Afraid that any more effort would crack the small thing, I instead turned my attention to the cryptic markings scrawled on the walls that I had never seen in all my ages. I had assumed that they were most likely some form of writing from whoever built the ruins. Unnerved, I hunched through one of the many wide corridors that laced the walls of the room, the light rapidly dimming. I had felt multiple gusts caress my legs from holes that allowed the passage of air from either the outside or somewhere down below. When I made it through that unholy stretch of artificial formation, I found myself in a nearly identical room. No jars were present in this one, however, just markings and corridors. Another nash in the structure allowed more of the blessed moonlight to pour in, and I was able to see the nature of both the walls and the markings much clearer. The starched walls were well worn down, likely due to elemental exposure, and the areas that were intact seemed to be layered with a dried, paste-like substance. The markings, on the other hand, were similar to the orange-red hue of rust, but also had a fresh, shimmering quality. I still see those markings in my dreams, when I find my mind can't settle down for a period of time. I debated if exploring further to see what those ruins could provide was a good idea or if I was to retreat, and shortly concluded that I had nothing to gain by trekking back to that lonely road, instead making my way through another corridor. The second time going through these hallways was just as bad as the first. I barely fit inside the small space, inching my way towards the other side, as wisps of current assaulted my body with haunting air. Although the room was in pristine condition, it was also dimly lit, the only source of light being from the previous room. More markings were painted on the walls, this time in an even larger size than the other rooms. A small construct sat on the far end of the wall, opposite of the hallway I had just crawled from. As it was the only new object in the room, I had to practically put my face on the floor just to inspect it, and found it to be a chair, or more accurately a throne. I had quickly stood up and took a few steps back in shock, when I suddenly felt a sharp pain coming from my right calf. I looked around in a mixture of panic and fear, as my blood seeped onto the floor. That blood changed everything. The moment it made contact with the floor, the markings began to glow, filling the entire room with an intense scarlet hue. As the room was now very well lit, I stared in absolute terror at the corner where a pile of human skeletons lay. Most of the bones had been ground into paste. I couldn't bear to think about the implications. The bestial noises from earlier had returned, rising into a shrill of barely tangible intellect. Without any hesitation I scampered through the narrow hallways which blew in the whispers of some unknown language. In each room I had passed through, the markings all glowed with a scarlet intensity that nearly blinded me. I ran out of the ruins and towards the haven of human road, my back illuminated with an extraordinary borealis of sanctifying moonlight and nightmarish scarlet. As soon as I could, I jumped on my motorcycle and drove faster than I had ever dared to drive in my life. The next time I refueled my motorcycle, I discovered tiny fingerprints where I would have placed mine, and remembered horribly that I was empty on fuel all those long hours ago. Until next time, my dear viewer.